So here we are eating fat into the gut. And you'd be surprised, in healthy people that happens in a period of 5 minutes after fat enters into the circulation. So once it's dumping the fat into the fat cell, or it is giving fat to the exercising muscle, the muscles we have in our body for consumption, or to store for future consumption, it becomes much smaller, and it's called a chylomicron remnant. So this fat-filled globule becomes smaller, it's called a remnant, and that's cleared up by the liver. And you would know you have normal fat handling by looking at a few key pieces of your blood work. So you can look at your triglycerides. If your triglycerides are less than 100, if your good cholesterol or HDL is greater than 55, not less than 55, I just noticed that I made a mistake out there. And invariably when you have this situation, the so-called bad cholesterol, which I call the other good cholesterol, is over 150. And your total cholesterol usually is over 200. So the question is, how does fat toxicity happen? So let's say you are metabolically unhealthy, you have become overweight, you are type 2 diabetic, you are insulin resistant. Now I threw out a term called insulin resistance, and I'll define that later, but for now just keep that in your mind. So if you are insulin resistant and you have obesity or type 2 diabetes, the fat cells are already filled and overstuffed and inflamed, and they say we can't accept fat anymore. So the fat backs up in the circulation. The muscles can take only so much fat. And by the way, you will see that our muscles can also get fatty. So they refuse to accept fat, so fat backs up in the circulation. The liver similarly will say, hey, I can't take any of these fat globules or the remnant globules, so they also hang in circulation. So the way you know that is that you will have high levels of triglycerides, low levels of good cholesterol, and a series of other blood markers that I will explain to you. But what you will end up is what is called ectopic fat deposition. So what ectopic fat is, that fat that remains in the circulation is trying to find a place to park itself. And it parks itself in your liver, in your heart, in your pancreas, and in your muscles. And the way she does that is that she will look at your triglycerides, see if they're high, look at your good cholesterol, see if it is low. She has got markers to see if insulin is working well. And if insulin is not working well, you will have high insulin levels along with high blood sugar levels. There are markers of your liver being inflamed in the blood work. One of the ones that we use is GGT. People are very surprised. They say, hey, this blood work says my GGT is normal, but you're telling me that it is high. Because we are used to seeing this marker for the last 10 years. And we know that when the GGT is in the teens, like 16, 17, 18, or low 20s, then your liver is good. But if it's in the high 20s or 30s or 40s, we know that your liver is struggling with handling fat. There is another hormone called adiponectin that we get sometimes. The adiponectin is a fat hormone that I will elaborate a little bit later. There will be other markers. There will be high blood pressure. There will be evidence of visceral obesity. In other words, you will have high waist to hip ratio. You will have high BMI. One of the things that people think is that insulin works only on the liver, but it works on the liver, it works on the muscles. People think that insulin only addresses blood sugar or glucose or carbohydrate, but it's also involved in fat metabolism. So here is a person who's consumed some carbs. These are sweet potatoes. It gets into the bloodstream as glucose. And if you can see my marker out here, this glucose then gets into the muscle cell through a channel. It's called the GLUT4 channel. You can just remember it as a glucose channel. So in the presence of insulin and this channel, the sugar is getting into the muscle. And if your muscle is healthy, physically active, it has a lot of mitochondria. Mitochondria are engines inside the muscle that burn fuel to generate horsepower, to generate wattage. And that horsepower is called ATP. So this fuel is then metabolized by the engines of the cell, which is mitochondria, and it generates energy. And if you have had a little too much carbs or carbohydrates, the rest of the carbohydrates are then efficiently converted to glycogen. So the muscle takes all the carbs that you have eaten. So one of the best advice I can give, especially as we get older, is to improve your muscle mass. If you have better muscle mass, it's just like a sump, like a sieve that sucks in all the carbohydrates that you have eaten, either converts it to energy or makes it into glycogen. So large muscle mass is an important aspect of maintaining normal blood sugars and preventing insulin resistance. Now I said there's also a role of insulin in fat metabolism. So what does insulin do to fat? So here is a person who's consumed some fatty steak. Now instead of glucose, there is fatty acids here. Now these fatty acids enter the muscle through a mechanism. I didn't draw that mechanism. And to get into the muscles, you need insulin and an enzyme called lipoprotein lipase. And the fat that enters the muscle can either be burned for energy. So you'd be surprised that people who are physically active, who are on a low carb diet, are actually burning more fat. And I'll show you that in subsequent slides. But the fat that they cannot burn, they can store it close to the mitochondria, close to the engines of the cells, in what is called intramyocellular fat, IMCL, intramyocellular lipid. So you would be surprised that the muscles can also store the fat you have eaten. So in somebody whose muscle is insulin sensitive, that means insulin is working well, these muscles have a lot of capability of storing fat. They have very healthy mitochondria. You will see these green little dots out here, these are mitochondria. So they have capacity to store intracellular fat, which is healthy fat. They have a very large engine, so they can burn the fat. In addition, because they are healthy, they will also have a lot of glucose channels. So they not only will have ability to store fat, but they will have ability to store glycogen. What they don't have is what is called toxic fat. So if the muscle gets unhealthy, one of the first things that happens is that it loses its capacity to burn fuel. So the mitochondria become shriveled, they're not as good, they're not burning as well, they are fewer in number. So the fat in the cells get rancid. You can only store so much. If it's not in dynamic movement to burning, the fat gets rancid. And as it gets rancid, it gets converted to two compounds. One of them is called ceramide. Now, if you go to my YouTube channel, you will see a good presentation on ceramide. But ceramide is necessary in small quantities for our cells. But when the quantities increase, the ceramide then goes and kills the mitochondria. And it prevents these glucose channels from being activated. And so the muscle can neither store glycogen well, nor can it use glucose well. And of course, it has a lot of rancid fat that it is not able to use because there is no capacity for it to burn. In other words, the engine is bad. So let's say that I have, or one of you has, normal blood sugar of about 100. or 90. And if you need about 4 of insulin to keep it there, 4 times 100 is 400, and there's a hypothetical number called 405. You divide it by that. If that number comes to less than 1, then you get a HOMA-IR, a score that tells you are insulin sensitive. That means insulin is working well. But in layman's term, if you have normal sugars and low levels of insulin, that means you need low levels of insulin to hold your sugar. But if you have normal sugars or slightly high sugars and high levels of insulin, that means that your body has to need a lot more insulin to drive the sugar into the cells. So the reason we get insulin resistance, and this has been worked out by some very good, intelligent people, is through what we call as lipotoxicity. That means fat toxicity. The cell is taking in fat. It is not able to burn the fat. When it doesn't burn the fat becomes rancid, and it creates ceramides. And as it creates ceramides, it creates a series of reactions in which it goes to the insulin receptor. So here is an insulin receptor sitting on top of the cell. There is insulin out there. And basically this fat, through a series of reaction, is inactivating the insulin receptor. So basically, once insulin sits on the insulin receptor, it creates a series of reactions that makes the glucose channel become active and suck in glucose. But this rancid fat is interrupting all the channels through which the insulin receptor activates the glucose spore or the glucose channel, and so the cell cannot take any glucose. So this is an important point, and the important point is that insulin resistance starves your body of fuel. In other words, the cell is starving. It's not able to get in the fuel, and in some ways that will drive your appetite. It will want you to eat more because what you're eating is not really getting into your cell.
HOMA-IR less than 1 means you are insulin sensitive. If you have normal glucose and low insulin, you're okay. If you have normal glucose but high insulin, then you're likely insulin resistant. And this is caused by lipotoxicity or fat toxicity, where the cell takes in fat, not able to burn it. It becomes rancid and creates ceramides. These turn off the insulin receptor. And the GLUT4, glucose receptor, which normally sucks in glucose for fuel, the rancid fat blocks the receptor. It starves the cell of fuel, starves the body of fuel, but it makes you hungry.
So in the setting of fasting, the liver is charged with providing fuel for our body, especially the brain. So if you fast, let's say you go on a fast, every part of your body is willing to fast. The muscles will reduce energy, the heart will slow down, your blood pressure will drop. But the brain refuses to fast. The brain says, no matter whether you are sleeping or fasting or exercising, I need this much fuel per minute, per hour. So the liver is charged with that responsibility, and it takes the fat from the fat cells, the fatty acids, and through the mitochondria it converts them to ketones. So that ketones can supply the brain. It takes the glycerol, which is part of your triglycerides, as well as a little bit of your muscle, and converts it through a process called gluconeogenesis. In other words, it makes blood sugar or glucose from fat as well as protein so that it can supply the brain. The brain can use ketones, but there is an obligate requirement for glucose, so it supplies that. So that's what the liver is charged to do.
During fasting, the liver is charged with providing fuel for every part of the body, and every part joins in with the fasting except the brain. It will not compromise. The liver takes fatty acids from the fat cells, converts them into ketones for the brain. The liver also takes glycerol from triglycerides and amino acids from the muscle, and through gluconeogenesis makes glucose from the fat and protein, also for the brain, which needs some glucose besides the ketones.
So the sweet potato will give me glucose, and in the presence of insulin, and because this liver is insulin sensitive, these channels are activated. They take in sugar and they convert whatever sugar they are taking into glucose that is not needed for immediate burning by the muscles. But there is one other important thing that the liver does, because as soon as you are eating food, there is plenty of food available. So the normal liver at this time shuts down glucose production. Otherwise, the liver is putting out glucose and ketones for the brain. But once you have eaten, it needs to shut it down. So there is a glucose overload. So in other words, they are taking in a huge amount of sugar. When you have that much sugar, you will need a lot more insulin for the sugar to get packed in. So in other words, you will raise your insulin levels. If this person is still normal, they'll convert some of the glucose to glycogen. They will still shut down the output from the liver of the glucose it was producing when it was fasting. So in other words, the liver shuts down the glucose. But a large amount of this glucose is converted to fat, because when you eat a large amount of carbs, there are signals going to the liver to activate the fat manufacturing machinery. So the fat machinery is jacked up, and the carbs that you have eaten, because we can store only a limited amount of carbs, the carbs will get converted to fat.
When breaking the fast, say with a sweet potato, when the liver is insulin sensitive, it takes in this glucose that is not immediately needed by the muscle. And when you're eating, the liver shuts down hepatic glucose output. If you're eating a standard American diet, high carbs, this causes glucose overload. So you need a whole lot of insulin to bring the glucose in, and the pancreas raises insulin to do that. If normal, meaning you're not insulin resistant, then it will convert some of that glucose into glycogen. It shuts down any glucose output and converts the rest of the glucose that came in from the blood into fat, because the carbs are signaling fat production.
So when the liver is not responding well to insulin, what it does is that it activates the carbs that it gets. It will not use it to convert to glycogen. So in other words, it's not storing it as carbs. It diverts the carbs from glycogen to fat. So in other words, an insulin resistant liver is not responding to insulin in terms of storing glucose, but it is hyper responding to insulin to make fat. So in other words, an insulin resistant liver will have high insulin and high fat manufacturing capacity, but it has another very important thing that we didn't understand, and that is that despite that person eating a sugar rich meal, the liver continues to put out sugar. So this is called hepatic glucose output, and this hepatic glucose output is not diminished. So you get a double whammy. You've eaten a large meal filled with carbs, and your liver refuses to recognize that and puts out more carbs, so your sugar in the bloodstream will go up even higher. It is not only activating fat manufacturing machinery, but it's also exporting fat, which is called VLDL, which you will get in your blood as triglycerides. Because insulin levels are high, when your insulin levels are high, the fat cannot make any ketones. So the brain could be potentially starved.
When the liver is insulin resistant, it is not responding well to insulin. It does not store glucose as carbs, as glycogen storage. Instead, it makes body fat. When one is eating a high carb diet and the liver is insulin resistant, it's a double whammy, because you have high blood sugar from eating carbs and the liver is pumping out glucose into the bloodstream. It's no longer making glycogen. The liver also manufactures body fat storage, and it pumps out triglycerides into the bloodstream. And at the same time, it's not making ketones, so the brain may be starving for fuel.
And if this process, now people say, okay, I have fatty liver and I'm going to get fibrosis or cirrhosis in the next few months. It doesn't happen like that. It takes 20 to 30 years of your liver protesting that, hey, look, I am getting fatty, I'm getting insulin resistant before cirrhosis happens. Same is the case with pancreas. So don't think that you have a short period of time to intervene. You have a long period of time to intervene, and sometimes in some individuals you can proceed to liver cancer.
When the liver is getting fatty, it does not happen in a short amount of time. It takes decades for it to proceed to getting cancer. Same with the pancreas.
This is the fast insulin response. A normal pancreas, as it's exposed to sugar, the insulin spikes way up before it comes down, and this has certain key features in terms of dropping the other hormones that will prevent the liver from behaving inappropriately. Here is a person with a fatty pancreas. The phase 1 insulin response is gone, even though they're making a lot more insulin. And the hormone that's going to make your liver function well in the setting of you eating refuses to go down. So your liver continues to put out sugar. So these are people who are morbidly obese. You can see that they are making a lot more insulin than lean people. So just wanted to show you that as you become heavier, the pancreas has to make more and more insulin.
Normal paracrine cell signaling relationship between insulin and glucagon. When insulin spikes up, glucagon shuts down, and this controls other hormones to keep the liver healthy. However, in morbidly obese, insulin spikes, but glucagon does not. The liver continues to release sugar into the blood.
No real problems. In other words, these hearts were obtained not at the time of heart transplantation, but for some other reason they didn't have much fat. But if they had heart failure and the hearts were obtained, they had more fat. If they had heart failure with obesity, the fat was even higher. And if they had heart failure with diabetes, these hearts were fat infiltrated. So in other words, the hearts had undergone lipotoxicity. And here is a study that's done in teenage girls. And they took teenage girls that were lean and obese. And so they are measuring hepatic fat, muscular fat, and pancreatic fat. These are the lean individuals. Their weight is a lot lower. See, 53 kilograms versus 105. Their body mass index is much different. The obese girls have much higher insulin levels. They have much higher levels of fat in their bloodstream. They have much lower levels of the good cholesterol, the HDL cholesterol. Remember that everybody focuses on the LDL. The LDL is not really any different at all. Look at their liver fat. The liver fat is almost twice as much. Look at their muscle fat. It's almost twice as much. Their pancreatic fat is more than twice as much.